September of 1588. The air was crisp with early autumn, and the roads leading to Buxton were dusted with the fading gold of fallen leaves. Robert Dudley rode slowly, his body weakened by years of service, by battles, by a life spent in the shadow of a crown. In his pocket, folded carefully, lay a letter from the Queen. A letter he would never finish reading. The countryside passed in a blur, the rolling hills, the distant forests, the quiet villages that had known neither his name nor his burden. Yet in his heart, every mile carried memories heavier than any armor he had worn. He had waited 30 years for her. 30 years of devotion, of silent hope, of watching from the edges of her world, never daring to step fully into it. And now, here, on a quiet stretch of road, that long vigil came to an end. Robert felt the weight of his years and the chill of inevitability. His hand went instinctively to the letter, brushing it gently, as if the paper itself could carry him back to her side. Who could have imagined, so many decades ago, that a boy and a girl, who had once whispered behind the walls of a house in London, would arrive at this moment? That a life shaped by loyalty, ambition, and the unspoken language of hearts restrained by duty would end on a lonely road, in a small inn, far from the courts and the grandeur where their story had begun. He took a shallow breath, and the world seemed to pause, holding its breath with him. The letter, warm from her hand, promised tenderness, promised connection, yet fate had conspired to keep them apart until his final hour. As his eyes fluttered closed, he could almost see her, the Queen, standing with her usual poise, her eyes full of secrets only he would ever know. And in that fleeting moment, the past and the present collided. The laughter of childhood, the whispered promises of youth, the unspoken longing of countless years, all wrapped into the silence of that autumn evening. He had waited, and she had held him close yet just out of reach. And now, the waiting was over. June of 1532. Robert Dudley was born into a world where ambition was more sacred than affection, more binding than love. The fifth son of John Dudley, the ambitious Duke of Northumberland, Robert entered life surrounded by splendor and expectation, a child in a household where every smile, every word, every gesture was measured against the scale of power. His earliest memories were of grand halls, of tapestries that told stories of conquest and lineage, of servants moving silently through corridors scented with wax and roses. Yet within that richness there was a coldness, a certain distance that spoke of a love conditional and strategic. The Dudleys prized influence above warmth, obedience above comfort. From the start, Robert understood that to be born Dudley was to carry a legacy heavy with both opportunity and peril. His father, a man whose eyes sparkled with cunning as often as they darkened with threats, prepared his sons not for play, but for survival in a world that would respect only the powerful. Each lesson, each expectation, each punishment, was a subtle shaping of a mind destined for prominence, or, in failure, for ruin. Even as a boy, Robert sensed the duality of his inheritance, the allure of prestige, and the shadow of danger that clung to the family name. A misstep, a misword, a misplaced glance could alter fate as sharply as a sword. And yet, somewhere deep inside, beyond ambition and duty, flickered a quiet yearning, for connection, for loyalty, for a companionship that would not bow to politics or fortune. Little did he know that this yearning would one day find its counterpart in a young girl named Elizabeth, a girl whose own life had been marked by absence and careful scrutiny. A girl whose heart, like his, would learn to navigate the treacherous waters of power while carrying the unspoken weight of longing. The seed of a lifetime of devotion, of hope and quiet endurance, had already been sown in the halls of privilege and shadow. And in the years to come, that seed would grow, shaping the course of both their lives in ways neither could yet imagine. Around the year 1548, Robert Dudley found himself sent to the house of Catherine Parr, the widow of Henry VIII, and her new husband, Thomas Seymour. The world he had known, the gilded halls of his father's ambition, the whispering corridors of court intrigue, suddenly widened into a place both foreign and protective, a sanctuary amidst the storms that had already shaped his young life. It was in that house, under the watchful eye of the Queen Dowager, that he first met Elizabeth, the young princess. She was just 15, small and poised, with eyes that seemed far too knowing for someone so young. Her presence was quiet but commanding, a mixture of caution and curiosity, of intelligence sharpened by loss. She had lost her mother early, endured years of uncertainty and suspicion, and yet there was a strength in her that neither smiled nor faltered in her gaze. Robert watched her from across the room, at first as any boy might watch a figure of fascination. But soon, he realized there was something different, something magnetic about Elizabeth. She carried the weight of expectation lightly, yet her mind was alert, probing, absorbing the world with a deliberate attention. When she spoke, her voice was measured, soft, yet it left echoes long after the words had ended. For Robert, this was a new kind of world, one where learning and curiosity mattered as much as strategy and survival. They spent hours in the gardens, their conversations tentative at first, filled with polite questions and guarded laughter. But slowly, they discovered a shared rhythm, a sense of humor that no one else seemed to understand, a careful teasing that spoke of intelligence meeting intelligence, a rare connection born of two hearts tempered by the precariousness of their lives. Even within the safety of Catherine Parr's home, danger was never far. The shadows of court politics lingered at the edges, and Thomas Seymour's ambitions and eventual recklessness would soon cast long, dark clouds over their young sanctuary. Yet in those fleeting, peaceful days Robert and Elizabeth found a world almost their own, a space where loyalty, affection, and quiet understanding could blossom, however fragile and fleeting. It was in these gardens, in these rooms, in these whispered conversations, that the foundation was laid. The bond between them, subtle but unbreakable, would guide them through decades of peril, distance, and unfulfilled longing. And though either of them knew it yet, the course of Robert Dudley's life, and the life of the future Queen Elizabeth I, would be forever intertwined from this first encounter, a tether invisible to all but the two of them. The sanctuary of Catherine Parr's house, which had seemed so protective, was shattered almost overnight. Catherine herself died in childbirth, leaving behind grief that rippled through everyone who had depended on her steady presence. The young Princess Elizabeth, only 15, lost not just a caretaker but a stabilizing anchor in her precarious world. And Robert Dudley, sent to her care at her house, felt the first deep pangs of helplessness in a life already shaped by danger. Thomas Seymour, ambitious and reckless, spiraled into peril. His charm masked a cunning that few could see until it was too late. He flirted openly with Elizabeth, ignoring the dangerous political undertones, the silent eyes watching from London, from the shadows of power. His schemes grew bolder, careless, and soon the consequences fell upon those nearest, Elizabeth, Robert, and the fragile household that remained. Robert watched helplessly as the walls around them closed in. The arrest of Seymour came like a thunderclap, sudden, violent, and terrifying. The charges were treason, plots against the crown, conspiracies that could have ended in death. For the young boy who had known only the cold ambition of his own family, the stakes suddenly became terrifyingly personal. And Elizabeth, already no stranger to danger, faced the full weight of the court's scrutiny. Her youth offered no shield. Her status, for all its royal significance, could not protect her from the merciless eyes of those eager to root out treachery. They were interrogated, watched, questioned. The fear in the air was palpable, a fog that clung to every room and hallway. Robert learned quickly how fragile life could be, how easily loyalty could be questioned, and how quickly a misstep could invite ruin. Yet through it all, there was a spark, a quiet, unspoken bond forming between him and Elizabeth. In whispers behind closed doors, in glances across corridors, in notes slipped secretly between their hands, a silent understanding emerged. They would endure, together, even if the world tried to break them. It was in these months, surrounded by the specter of death and the harshness of politics, that Robert's loyalty crystallized. It was not mere admiration, nor fleeting affection. It was a commitment forged in fear, in survival, and the shared experience of a world that could so easily destroy them. And Elizabeth, for her part, recognized in him a steadfastness, a courage, a presence that was unlike any other. He would become, in her life, an anchor, quiet, unwavering, patient, and always just out of reach. The tragedy of Catherine's death, and the subsequent fall of Thomas Seymour, marked a turning point. The world outside their small sanctuary had shown its cruelty, its unpredictability. And yet, in the midst of chaos, Robert Dudley and Elizabeth I had begun a bond that would endure decades of waiting, of longing, and of a love that could never fully declare itself. The Tower of London loomed like a silent sentinel, its stone walls holding centuries of secrets, whispers, and fears. Robert Dudley, barely 20, found himself within those cold walls, alongside Elizabeth, also 20, both prisoners of a world that seemed to delight in testing the strength of the young and ambitious. The rebellion of Wyatt had failed, and Elizabeth, as the daughter of a king, was suspected of ambition too dangerous for a woman, too dangerous for anyone. Robert had already known danger, but this was different. Here, the air was thick with tension, and every corridor echoed with footsteps of men who could decide life or death in a moment. The windows, small and barred, let in slivers of light that barely touched the stone floors. Nights were long, and shadows seemed to creep across the walls like reminders that freedom was fragile, fleeting. Through it all, Robert and Elizabeth found each other. Not with grand gestures or whispered promises, but with small signs, subtle signals, and notes passed secretly. They shared fleeting moments in the dim light, a hand brushing a hand, a glance that lingered longer than propriety allowed. In a place designed to strip away dignity, they discovered a quiet sanctuary in one another. They prayed together. They spoke of nothing and everything. Each letter exchanged was a lifeline, a tether connecting two souls in a place designed to sever all ties. Robert's loyalty was absolute. He became her shadow, her confidant, the one constant in a world that was cruel and unpredictable. Elizabeth, in turn, leaned on him, found in his presence a rare comfort, a reminder that even in chains, there could be solace. The days stretched endlessly. Rumors of executions, of conspiracies, of betrayal, surrounded them like a storm they could not escape. And yet, amidst the fear and the isolation, their bond grew stronger. They learned to read each other's silences, to find humor in the smallest things, to survive together not only by intellect but by trust. By the time their confinement ended, something had shifted irreversibly. They were no longer just a princess and a nobleman. They were two hearts entwined by shared survival, by unspoken understanding, by the tender threads of devotion that would guide them for decades to come. And though the tower would eventually release them into the light of freedom, the shadows of those days would linger, shaping their connection in ways that would define the rest of their lives. Robert Dudley, still young, still full of ambition, entered a marriage of convenience. Amy Robsart was beautiful, gentle, and the heiress of a comfortable estate, a match that promised wealth and stability, but not the fire of the heart. For Robert, it was a necessary step, a bridge to the court he longed to inhabit, a way to secure his future in a world where loyalty and favor were as fragile as glass. Amy waited quietly in the countryside, a life of soft light and green fields contrasting sharply with the intrigues of court. Letters between them were formal, polite, but distant. She loved in the ways expected of a gentlewoman, but Robert's gaze, his thoughts, were elsewhere, always on Elizabeth, always at the edge of her world, where the princess's intelligence and spirit drew him like a quiet flame he could not touch. Even in those early years of marriage, Robert felt the tension of dual lives. By day, he performed the duties of a husband to Amy, keeping appearances, maintaining propriety. By night, his thoughts were full of Elizabeth, of their shared laughter, of the tender understanding that had begun in the hallways and gardens of Catherine Parr's house. He carried her image like a secret, a private warmth against the cold calculations of ambition. The court called him. Every summons, every ball, every ceremony pulled him farther from the quiet life Amy expected. The streets of London, the corridors of power, were alive with possibility and danger. And in those corridors, Elizabeth waited, always observing, always present, though the rules of court dictated silence and distance. Robert's heart became a careful balance between duty and desire, between what was proper and what was inevitable. Amy's death, years later, would cast a shadow over his name. A fall down a staircase, a life ended too soon, whispered by Europe as scandal, as rumor, as accusation. For Robert, it was a tragedy entwined with hope and fear, the hope of finally being free to draw closer to Elizabeth, and the fear of the shadows that would follow him, the suspicions that would never leave, the court that would never forget. But in this early chapter, in the quiet moments of his marriage, he learned patience. He learned restraint. And above all, he learned to wait. For Elizabeth. For a life that could never be simple, never public, never assured. For a love that would stretch across decades, tested by politics, by death, by the fragile human heart. November 17th, 1558. The news came like the first light of dawn breaking over a long, dark night. Mary Tudor had died, and Elizabeth, once the quiet observer, the girl confined by circumstance and suspicion, was now Queen of England. The weight of the crown pressed upon her slender shoulders, yet there was a spark in her eyes, a mixture of awe, determination, and the quiet knowledge that she had survived everything the world had thrown at her. Robert Dudley, riding swiftly to Hatfield to be at her side, felt a thrill he had never allowed himself to name. For decades, he had lingered at the edge of her life, loyal, patient, careful. Now, the world had shifted, and Elizabeth, radiant in her new role, needed him in ways that were at once official and deeply personal. He was appointed her master of the horse, a position that kept him close to her every day, a silent witness to the birth of a reign that would be remembered for centuries. The court whispered. Nobles and ambassadors observed the closeness between the queen and her favored nobleman. They dined together, walked in the gardens, laughed in private moments that the world only glimpsed in hurried gossip. Robert's presence was a constant, a shadow, a reassurance, and a temptation all at once. He was near enough to feel the warmth of her hand, the intelligence in her gaze, the quiet humor that few others understood. Elizabeth herself felt the comfort of his loyalty. She had been alone so often, alone in childhood, alone under the scrutiny of court, alone in a world that measured her worth against men's ambition and suspicion. And yet here was Robert, steadfast, unwavering, a familiar presence she could trust without thought. With him, the crown's weight felt lighter, the endless expectations less crushing. With him, she could almost be herself, even if only in fleeting moments behind the closed doors of the palace. And so began a delicate dance of proximity and restraint. Every smile, every glance, every shared joke carried layers of meaning that only they could read. Ambition, duty, and the shadow of scandal lingered, but within the quiet moments of the palace halls and the garden's paths, there was tenderness, there was intimacy, there was a connection neither title nor protocol could sever. Elizabeth had become the most powerful woman in England, yet her heart, quiet and private, still held space for Robert. And Robert, who had waited through years of uncertainty, of silent longing, of unspoken devotion, understood that this was only the beginning. The crown could give her authority, but it could not grant him the one thing he truly desired, her unreserved love. And so, they moved forward together, bound by history, by survival, and by the faint, persistent thread of a love that would endure trials either could yet foresee. Robert Dudley's position at court had grown steadily, quietly, almost imperceptibly, until it became undeniable. He was no longer just the boy who had shared whispered conversations with Elizabeth behind Catherine Parr's walls, nor simply the loyal nobleman who had endured the Tower. Now, he was her constant companion, her shadow, her confidant in a world where trust was a rare and precious thing. The Queen spent more time with Robert than with any adviser, more than with any diplomat or counselor. They walked together in the gardens, where the air was heavy with the scent of roses and clipped hedges. They dined together in private chambers, sharing laughter and conversation that was intimate and unguarded, a respite from the formality and intrigue that filled every corner of the palace. In those moments, the world beyond the palace walls seemed to shrink, leaving only the two of them in a quiet orbit of shared understanding. The court noticed. Ambassadors from Spain and France whispered of the closeness between Elizabeth and her master of the horse. Rumors swirled through the halls like smoke, uncontainable and persistent. Some called him her secret husband, others her shadow king. Yet Elizabeth, ever composed, allowed herself only subtle gestures, a hand lightly resting on his arm, a quiet glance that lingered too long, knowing the eyes of the world were always upon them. Robert, for his part, moved with care. Every gesture was measured, every word weighed against both propriety and the language of the heart. He understood the precarious balance they maintained, too bold, and scandal could ruin them both, too distant, and he might lose the fragile closeness they had cultivated through years of waiting. His loyalty was absolute, but it was tempered by patience. 30 years of patient devotion had taught him that love in this court was never simple, never safe, never fully his to claim. Yet in private, away from the eyes of advisers and courtiers, there was laughter, warmth, and the kind of intimacy that words alone could not capture. They shared stories from childhood, secrets, fears, and quiet observations of the world beyond the palace gates. And in these stolen moments, Elizabeth allowed herself to be seen as she truly was, clever, spirited, vulnerable, yet infinitely commanding, and Robert found in her presence a solace, a certainty, and a love that would remain unbroken even as the tides of history threatened to sweep them apart. The whispers of the court were only the beginning. Their bond, already strengthened by years of shared experience and survival, would face countless trials ahead, political intrigue, rival suitors, and the shadow of scandal that would one day darken their lives forever. But for now, in these first years of Elizabeth's reign, Robert Dudley was her closest companion, and she his entire world, a truth understood in silence, in glances, in the quiet language of hearts that had long learned to wait. September 8, 1560. The news arrived like a cold gust of wine through the corridors of Dudley's household. Amy Robsart was dead. Found at the foot of a staircase in her home at Cumnor, her neck broken, the door locked from within. The whispers began almost immediately. Some called it a tragic accident, a cruel twist of fate. Others, less charitable, suggested darker possibilities, rumors that would haunt Robert for the rest of his life. He received the news with a strange mixture of grief and helplessness. Amy had been distant in their marriage, a life apart from his ambitions, yet she had been human, fragile, and innocent in ways that reminded him of what he had left behind to chase a future at court. Her death was not just a loss, it was a shadow cast across his name, a weight of suspicion that would cling to him like a second skin. Europe reacted with a storm of outrage and gossip. Some whispered that Robert had removed an obstacle, that he had finally cleared the path to Elizabeth's hand. Ambassadors wrote hurried letters, their words dripping with intrigue and accusation. England's courtiers murmured in the hallways of the palace, and even Queen Elizabeth herself was forced to navigate the treacherous waters of scandal with caution. The world was ready to believe the worst, and rumors spread faster than truth. For Robert, the emotional toll was immense. He had lost a wife, a life, a name free from disgrace, and yet he could not abandon the one person he truly loved. Elizabeth's response was cautious, measured, as always. She sent him secret letters, glimpses of care and concern, while maintaining the distance demanded by her position. Publicly, she was the queen, untouchable, untarnished, the Virgin Queen, whose image must remain pristine. Privately, her heart ached with the knowledge that Robert's loyalty had been tested by grief, by suspicion, by a world that would never let them be free. Robert, in turn, felt the impossibility of his situation. He had waited, so patiently, so devotedly, for Elizabeth, and now the world was poised to twist the circumstances of his life into a story of betrayal. And yet, in the quiet moments, in the letters passed with care, in the fleeting glances across the palace, he knew that their bond remained unbroken. They could not claim love openly, but the tether between them, strengthened by decades of patience, of shared danger, of silent understanding, had grown unbreakable. Amy's death left an indelible mark, a wound that neither of them could ignore. It was a reminder of the fragility of life, the cruelty of fate, and the relentless scrutiny of society. And yet, even amidst scandal, fear, and sorrow, Robert and Elizabeth moved forward, bound together by a connection that was as secret as it was profound, a love that would endure, despite the world, despite the crown, despite time itself. The court buzzed with rumors and suspicion, and Elizabeth felt the weight of the world pressing against her slender shoulders. Amy Robsart's death had cast a shadow over Robert Dudley, and by extension, over the Queen herself. Every gesture, every glance between them was watched, dissected, and twisted into scandal. The halls of Whitehall whispered with the sound of suspicion, and the eyes of Europe were upon her, eager to see the virgin Queen falter. Elizabeth's heart ached with both fury and fear. She wanted to hold Robert close, to reassure him, to brush away the cold shadows of accusation. And yet, her crown demanded restraint, her position demanded caution. She could not show weakness, not to her council, not to foreign envoys, not even to herself. In public, she was composed, untouchable, a symbol of strength. Privately, she wrote secret letters, sent hurried notes, arranging stolen meetings in quiet gardens or shadowed corridors, where they could speak freely, laugh softly, and breathe without the constant gaze of the court upon them. Robert waited, as he always had. His loyalty was steadfast, his devotion unshaken. Each clandestine meeting, each hidden note, was a reminder that their connection had survived scandal, suspicion, and the relentless expectations of power. Yet he could not deny the pain of distance, the quiet gnawing of uncertainty. Elizabeth's crown protected her, but it also kept her just out of reach, a brilliant light that illuminated his world yet remained untouchable. The political pressure was relentless. Advisers demanded explanations, whispered warnings, and the council urged caution. The European courts relished in the scandal, and Elizabeth knew that any misstep could invite disaster. And so she maintained her composure, her public distance, all while preserving the secret warmth she reserved for Robert, her shadow, her confidant, her constant in a world that never allowed her to be fully free. Their love, unspoken yet undeniable, existed in glances, in soft touches, in letters folded with care. It was a love constrained by duty, by expectation, by survival, and yet it was profound, enduring, and unbreakable. Every act of patience, every silent hour of longing, bound them closer together, and though the world judged, they remained tethered by the quiet certainty that neither distance nor scandal could sever. Elizabeth had learned, through years of survival and loss, that power required sacrifice. And the greatest sacrifice of all was love, love that could never be claimed openly, love that existed in whispers and shadows, in stolen moments that would linger in memory long after the world had turned its gaze elsewhere. Robert Dudley had become her constant, her heart's companion, and in that unspoken truth, both found solace, strength, and the quiet hope that their connection would endure, no matter the trials yet to come. The question of marriage hovered over them like a shadow, always present but never spoken aloud. Elizabeth often sat alone in her chambers, her fingers tracing the edge of her crown, thinking of Robert. Could she risk the heart she had so carefully guarded? Could she step beyond the boundaries of duty, beyond the eyes of the council, beyond the ever-watchful world that measured every word, every gesture, every glance? She considered him, as she had for years, with a mixture of longing and fear. Robert had waited for her, patiently, devotedly, through childhood games, whispered secrets, and the dangers of youth. He had stood by her when the world threatened to crush them both, his loyalty unshakable, his devotion clear in every quiet act of care. Yet the crown demanded sacrifice. To marry a man who had been suspected, who carried the weight of scandal, could endanger everything she had worked so hard to preserve. Robert, for his part, watched her from the edges of court, his heart full yet careful, knowing the impossible balance they maintained. He dared not pressure her, dared not speak what his soul longed to declare. He served, he waited, he endured, because he understood the world she had inherited, a world where love was a fragile, dangerous thing, and where patience was sometimes the only way to preserve it. They communicated in subtle ways. A lingering look, a soft word, a note slipped into her hand when the corridors were empty. In those moments, the world outside vanished. There was only them, only the quiet understanding that words could not capture, only the tether of hearts bound by years of shared trials and unspoken promises. Elizabeth knew that some choices could never be made lightly. Her crown, her people, her duty, they demanded vigilance, restraint, and careful calculation. And yet, in the secret spaces between her public life and private longing, she allowed herself to feel, to hope, to imagine a world where Robert could be more than a shadow, more than a confidant, more than a constant presence just beyond reach. And so the struggle continued, a dance of patience and desire, of love restrained by duty, of hearts tethered by devotion and longing. Robert remained near, always, silently, faithfully, and Elizabeth carried the weight of possibility and impossibility together, knowing that their story, however constrained by circumstance, was theirs alone. Elizabeth's gift to Robert was more than a title. It was a recognition of his devotion, a tangible sign of her favor in a world that could be cruel and unforgiving. When she called him her Earl, he felt both pride and a quiet ache. Pride for the honor bestowed, for the acknowledgement that his years of patient loyalty had not gone unnoticed. Ache for the one thing the crown could never grant him, her heart, freely and entirely, without the constraints of duty or scandal. With the title came lands, wealth, and a place of prominence at court. Yet all of it felt hollow without her full presence. He walked the halls with a careful composure, smiling for the courtiers, accepting congratulations with measured gratitude, but in private, he longed for what could not be named, what could not be claimed. Elizabeth's eyes followed him in subtle ways, a soft glance, a fleeting smile, a brush of hand against hand, small gestures that spoke volumes in a world that forbade their love from being declared. The court watched them, always, measuring every interaction, parsing every word. Some whispered envy, others suspicion, but neither Robert nor Elizabeth faltered. Their connection had deepened over years of shared trials, of whispered secrets, of survival through fear and uncertainty. The title changed nothing in their private world. It merely made the distance between them more visible to the outside world. In quiet moments, away from the courtiers and advisers, Robert would linger near her chambers, and they would speak in the language they had perfected over decades, not in words that proclaimed love, but in words that confirmed understanding, trust, and devotion. Every conversation, every shared look was a promise, unspoken yet binding, a thread connecting them through time and circumstance. Elizabeth knew that she could never fully surrender her heart, not publicly, not even privately, without risking everything. And Robert knew that his loyalty must be patient, enduring, resilient, for the woman he loved was both sovereign and human, constrained by the crown and yet full of quiet longing. Their world was a delicate balance of power and desire, of proximity and restraint, of devotion that could never be claimed outright but would endure, silent, steadfast, and eternal. And so they moved through the days, side by side yet separated by duty, bound by love that was patient, restrained, and unbreakable, a love that would define both their lives, even as the crown demanded all that Elizabeth could give, leaving her heart quietly tethered to the one man who had waited for her all these years. As the years passed, Elizabeth's court became a stage for the endless dance of power, politics, and desire. Suitors came and went, each bearing titles, lands, or foreign promises, but none could capture her mind, her wit, or her attention as Robert did. She allowed herself to toy with their affections, a subtle smile here, a witty remark there, enough to amuse herself and provoke whispers, but never enough to betray the quiet truth of her heart. Robert watched these interactions with a mixture of pride and torment. Each flirtation, each conversation with a potential suitor, was a test of patience and endurance. His chest ached with jealousy, yet he restrained himself, knowing that any outward display could destroy everything he had waited for, the fragile, unspoken bond they shared. In his private moments, he grappled with frustration, longing, and the enduring hope that someday the world might allow them a life unshadowed by duty and suspicion. Elizabeth, for her part, understood the games she played. Each suitor was a tool, a distraction, a test of her own control over heart and realm. She delighted in their attentions, yet she kept Robert always near, subtly asserting his presence as the constant amidst the temporary, the unchanging amidst the shifting tides of courtly intrigue. Their private glances, secret notes, and quiet conversations were the only reality that mattered, the only world in which love could exist untouched by the relentless gaze of society. The courtiers whispered, the ambassadors observed, and Europe speculated. "The Queen favors him," they said. "She flirts with others, yet her heart remains elsewhere." Robert felt the weight of these speculations press upon him, but he did not falter. He understood that love in Elizabeth's world was a careful, deliberate thing, measured against duty, survival, and the ever-present risk of scandal. And so the years passed, filled with subtle dances of the heart, private conversations, and stolen moments that only they could recognize. Every encounter, every shared glance, was imbued with the history of decades, the memory of dangers survived together, and the quiet understanding that their love, though never spoken aloud, was enduring and unbreakable. It was a love that defied the whispers of the court, the ambitions of men, and even the constraints of a crown that demanded devotion and vigilance above all else. Through it all, Robert remained steadfast, and Elizabeth's eyes, whenever they met his, spoke of a truth that the world could never touch, that she loved only him, in silence, in restraint, in the quiet, enduring language of hearts tethered across time and circumstance. The years of courtly intrigue and whispered conversations could not contain Robert Dudley forever. A restless spirit burned within him, a need to prove himself beyond loyalty, beyond favor, beyond the soft confines of palace walls. So he turned to the military, to campaigns in distant lands, to battles that would test both courage and endurance. The fields of the Netherlands became his proving ground, a place where ambition met danger, where every decision carried the weight of life and death. Elizabeth, from her palace, watched him go with a mixture of pride, fear, and longing. She had grown accustomed to his constant presence, the quiet steadiness that anchored her life amidst the swirling currents of court. Now, with him gone, the palace felt hollow, the gardens too wide, the corridors too silent. Every morning, she found herself imagining him in the chaos of battle, his face set with determination, his heart still tethered to her even amidst the smoke and clamor of war. Letters were their lifeline. Robert wrote sparingly, carefully, each word chosen to convey not only strategy and duty, but also the subtle reminders of devotion that could not be spoken aloud in the midst of soldiers and enemies. Elizabeth read them slowly, savoring the faint warmth behind each line, feeling the pulse of his heart in the ink on the page. In return, she wrote with elegance and restraint, offering counsel, encouragement, and sometimes a quiet word of longing, always mindful that the world could never see what existed only between them. Yet the campaigns were not gentle. Robert faced setbacks, betrayals, the sting of failure, and the relentless pressure of responsibility. Each night, he imagined Elizabeth in her quiet chambers, the soft candlelight illuminating her thoughtful face, and found the strength to endure. He fought not only for duty or honor, but for the fragile tether of love that stretched across miles, across uncertainty, across the unspoken dreams of a life that could never be fully theirs. Elizabeth, in turn, felt the emptiness of his absence in ways that the court could not perceive. She walked the palace gardens in long, silent hours, replaying their conversations, their shared laughter, their unspoken promises. Every movement of the court, every ambitious suitor, every diplomatic crisis was a reminder of the precariousness of her position and the impossibility of surrendering fully to the one heart she desired above all others. And yet, in quiet moments, when the doors were closed and the world was hushed, she allowed herself to feel the warmth of his presence, to imagine his voice near her ear, to let herself drift for a moment in the comfort of a love that existed beyond sight, beyond sound, beyond reach. The seasons changed, campaigns began and ended, yet the bond between them remained unbroken. Distance, danger, and the trials of war could not sever the thread that connected their hearts. And though Robert returned from some campaigns weary, wounded in spirit if not in body, his first thought was always of Elizabeth, his mind drifting to the quiet corners of her chambers, to the stolen moments that no one else could ever witness. In these years, their love matured, deepened, became something almost sacred. It was not the fire of fleeting passion, but the steady flame of devotion, patient, enduring, and resilient. Each campaign, each trial, each long night apart only reinforced the truth they both carried silently, that no crown, no court, no rumor, and no distance could diminish the bond they shared. It was a quiet, enduring love, one that would define their lives and echo through the corridors of history, even when words were impossible, and the world demanded restraint. By the time Robert returned from the campaigns, years had passed, and the world had shifted in ways he could not fully control. He had given his heart, his loyalty, and his very life to Elizabeth, yet there remained a distance that could not be crossed, a barrier built by duty, expectation, and the relentless scrutiny of the court. And in that silence, a choice was made, one that would change everything. Lettice Knowles, a cousin of the Queen, a gentlewoman of charm and beauty, entered his life in quiet, whispered meetings that carried both comfort and temptation. In secret, away from the prying eyes of courtiers and advisers, Robert found himself drawn to her, perhaps as much from longing as from the unbearable weight of waiting. And one night, when the world was hushed and the candles burned low, he married her quietly, without fanfare, without permission, without Elizabeth's knowledge. When the truth reached Elizabeth, It struck her like a blow she could not shield herself from. Her chambers, once a refuge, seemed suddenly too small, the walls pressing in, suffocating her with rage and grief. The woman she trusted, the man she had loved with a patience that spanned decades, had crossed the line. Lettuce was banished from court, never to return, yet the wound remained, not for Lettuce, but for the Queen herself, whose heart had been betrayed in silence. Robert, meanwhile, felt a torment unlike any he had known. The decision, made in solitude, in a moment of weakness and human frailty, had irrevocably changed the bond he shared with Elizabeth. He remained devoted, faithful, endlessly patient, yet he could not undo the damage of his choice. Every glance from Elizabeth thereafter carried the weight of anger, disappointment, and unspoken pain, a reminder that love in this world was never simple, never safe, never fully attainable. Yet even in the shadow of betrayal, their connection endured. Elizabeth continued to write, to meet in secret, to maintain the delicate thread that had bound them for decades. And Robert, despite the wall that now existed between them, continued to serve, to protect, to endure, knowing that his devotion, even when imperfect, was all he could offer. Their love had been tested, scarred, and reshaped, yet it remained, quiet, enduring, a flame that neither time, nor anger, nor circumstance could fully extinguish. The court watched with bated breath, the whispers never ceasing, but behind closed doors, in moments that belonged only to them, Robert and Elizabeth carried on in a world of stolen glances and silent understanding. Their story had grown more complicated, more painful, yet also more profound, revealing the truth of human longing, the endurance of the heart, and the quiet resilience of love that could never be fully claimed, yet could never be broken. And in these moments, as the seasons shifted and the world pressed in from all sides, Robert understood that devotion was not measured by possession, but by steadfast presence, by the willingness to remain, to wait, and to love, even when love itself had become a landscape of restraint and sorrow. After the storm of Lettuce's secret marriage, Robert Dudley returned fully to duty, carrying a quiet sorrow in his heart. The glow of courtly favor remained, yet it was now tinged with the memory of what had been lost, the possibility of a love fully shared, unshadowed by secrecy or anger. He devoted himself to service, to the endless tasks demanded by Elizabeth's reign, moving through the halls and gardens of the palace with the composure that had become his shield. Elizabeth observed him from her chambers, her mind a careful balance of frustration, longing, and the unyielding demands of the crown. She no longer allowed herself to indulge openly in the warmth of his presence. The moments they shared became fewer, shorter, more measured. Yet even in the restraint, there was an undeniable connection. A glance across the council chamber, a softly uttered word of thanks, the subtle touch of a hand brushing against his in passing. These small gestures carried volumes that no one else could read. Robert immersed himself in the machinery of governance and diplomacy, undertaking missions on behalf of the Queen, commanding troops, negotiating with foreign emissaries, ensuring the stability of a realm constantly tested by ambition and intrigue. Each task was a reminder of the life he had chosen, the loyalty he had pledged, and the enduring thread that still connected him to Elizabeth, even as the intimacy of the past had been replaced by the formality of duty. At night, when the palace quieted and candlelight flickered across tapestries and stone walls, he would reflect on the decades of waiting, the whispered conversations of youth, the trials of court, the secret letters and fleeting moments of closeness that had defined their bond. He knew the truth of their connection, that it was unbreakable, enduring, and profound, yet he also knew that it could never be fully realized. The crown's demands, the shadow of scandal, and the constraints of duty shaped every possible path, and his heart had learned to navigate them with patience and silent devotion. Elizabeth, too, felt the weight of what had passed. She carried the memory of his loyalty, his presence, and the unspoken love that had survived every trial. In her quiet moments she allowed herself to remember the warmth of his laughter, the steady reassurance of his gaze, and the feeling of being understood in a world that so often misunderstood her. And though she would never allow the world to see her vulnerability, she kept the thread of their bond alive in private letters, in subtle gestures, in moments of quiet connection that no one else could witness. And so the years continued, each day marked by duty and restraint, each night by the silent endurance of hearts tethered across expectation and circumstance. Robert remained steadfast, and Elizabeth, despite the walls she had built around her heart, remained aware of the presence that had defined her life for decades. Their love, though constrained and tested, persisted, a quiet, enduring force, patient and resilient, waiting for no applause, needing no recognition, carrying on in the shadow of crowns, politics, and the relentless passage of time. The summer air was heavy with tension as England faced the threat of the Spanish Armada. From the palace windows, Elizabeth could see the bustling preparations along the Thames, the soldiers marching, the fleet readying its course. Yet her mind was not on strategy or duty alone, it was on Robert. He was there, at the forefront, commanding troops with courage and precision, yet fevered and worn from years of service, each day of exertion leaving its mark upon him. She remembered his youth, the boy who had shared whispered secrets in Catherine Parr's house, the young man who had endured the Tower, the friend and confidant who had stood unwaveringly by her side through decades of trials. And now, as he faced the greatest danger of their age, Elizabeth felt a deep, unspoken fear. He was more than a commander, more than a nobleman. He was the keeper of her heart in a world that demanded so much from both of them. Robert wrote when he could, his letters careful, full of detail about the movements of the fleet, the condition of the men, the uncertainty that hovered over every decision. Yet beneath the strategy, there were small lines, almost hidden, that spoke of care, of longing, of the quiet desire to be near her even as distance and duty tore them apart. Elizabeth read each one slowly, savoring the hidden warmth in his words, and wrote back with her own quiet encouragement, with subtle reminders that he was never truly alone, even on the battlefield. The days were long, and worry gnawed at her constantly. She paced the halls of Whitehall, watching the sky for signs, listening for news, each messenger's arrival bringing a mixture of dread and hope. And yet, in these anxious hours, she remembered the decades of patience, the years of shared trials, the quiet moments that had defined their bond. She drew strength from the knowledge that Robert's loyalty, like a steady flame, would not falter, and that their connection, though constrained, was unbreakable. Meanwhile, Robert pressed on, his body weary, his mind focused, yet always carrying the thought of Elizabeth. He imagined her in her chambers, candlelight illuminating her face, her expression unreadable yet filled with the warmth he had learned to know in their private moments. He fought not only for the safety of England, but for the enduring tether between their hearts, a bond that gave him courage when fear threatened to overtake him. Victory came, slowly and painfully, each battle a test of will, strategy, and endurance. The Armada was repelled, England's shores secured, and the relief that swept across the land was mirrored in the quiet, private relief Elizabeth felt when she heard of Robert's survival. Yet even in triumph, she knew the fragility of life, the relentless passage of time, and the preciousness of each day spent near him, however fleeting. In the quiet evenings that followed, they wrote to each other, words full of care and subtle affection, a language of the heart understood only by them. And though they could not claim the freedom of love in its fullest, they carried it with them in silence, in glances, in letters, in the steady presence that had defined their lives for decades. The campaign had tested them, stretched them across miles in danger, yet their bond had endured, quiet, steadfast, and eternal. By the time Robert received her letter, he was weary, his body still aching from the rigors of campaign, his spirit tempered by decades of waiting, hoping, and serving. Yet, as he unfolded the delicate parchment, his hands trembled slightly, not from weakness, but from the quiet anticipation of words he had longed to hear. The letter was warm, almost tender, a tone Elizabeth rarely allowed herself to use, reserved only for him, in moments when the world was shut out and only their hearts mattered. She called him her Robin, a name of affection, of intimacy, of a bond that had survived everything, scandal, war, distance, and the relentless demands of crown and court. The words were measured, restrained, yet each one carried a depth of feeling that Robert had learned to treasure more than any public declaration could convey. He read it slowly, savoring every phrase, every carefully chosen expression. Her affection, though quiet, was undeniable, and it filled him with a warmth that no victory, no honor, no title could match. In that moment, all the years of waiting, all the patience, all the silent endurance, seemed to converge into a single, perfect truth, that Elizabeth, the woman who had been both sovereign and guardian of his heart, had loved him in her own way, fiercely and steadfastly, even if it could never be declared to the world. Robert tucked the letter close to his chest, feeling the pulse of her words against his heart. The road ahead to Buxton was long, and he traveled slowly, savoring the fragile peace that the letter brought him. In his mind, he replayed decades of memory, the childhood games, the whispered secrets in shadowed corridors, the trials of the Tower, the stolen glances at court, the moments of quiet connection that had defined their lives. And through it all, he felt a profound gratitude for a love that had endured unshaken, despite the impossible circumstances that had always stood between them. He imagined Elizabeth in her private chambers, reading her own letters, reflecting on the careful, deliberate life she had built, and perhaps allowing herself, just for a moment, to feel the full weight of the love she had reserved for him. It was a love that required patience, restraint, and courage, the courage to love deeply while keeping the world at bay. And Robert, carrying her words like a talisman, felt the steady reassurance that he had been her constant, her confidant, and her heart's companion, even when the crown demanded all else. As he rode, the landscape blurred past him, yet the letter remained vivid in his mind, a glowing tether to the one woman who had defined his life. Each line he had read again and again, memorized, cherished, a quiet sanctuary of affection, a reminder that their love existed beyond sight, beyond sound, beyond even touch. And in that fragile, perfect intimacy, he found solace, courage, and the quiet joy of knowing that, at least in that moment, the Queen's heart was his, as it had been in every silent year they had endured together. The journey continued, slow and thoughtful, each mile bringing him closer to Buxton, yet each moment made precious by the knowledge that in his pocket, pressed near his heart, lay the tangible proof of the bond he had waited decades to experience, a bond unbroken, enduring, and unshakable. And as he rode, he allowed himself, at last, a private smile, a quiet recognition that love, even when constrained, even when silent, could be the most profound force of all. The journey to Cornbury was slow, the autumn air crisp and tinged with the scent of falling leaves. Robert felt a weariness unlike any he had known before, not from battles, nor from duty, but from the accumulation of years, of patience, of love restrained by circumstance and crown. Every mile he rode seemed heavier than the last, each step closer to Buxton a reminder that his strength was not what it once had been. Yet even in his fatigue, he carried Elizabeth's letter close to his heart, pressing the fragile parchment against his chest as though it were a talisman against the relentless passage of time. He thought of her, of the woman whose presence had defined his life, whose eyes had held the quiet acknowledgment of a love that could never be fully claimed. And though he would never speak it aloud, he felt a profound peace in knowing that she had loved him, in her own way, through all the trials, the distance, and the silence. As he entered the small manor at Cornbury, he felt the weight of his years and the toll of his body. The rooms were quiet, almost empty, save for the soft crackle of a hearth and the faint scent of autumn outside. He settled into a chair by the window, gazing at the trees shedding their leaves in a golden cascade, thinking of the countless autumns he and Elizabeth had endured apart, and the fleeting moments of warmth they had shared. His thoughts drifted through decades, the games of youth, the tower's cold stone walls, the laughter and whispered confidences in shadowed corridors, the secret letters, the stolen glances, and the silent understanding that had bound their hearts together. He thought of every campaign, every challenge, every moment he had waited, hoping for a life that could never be fully theirs. And in that reflection, there was a quiet satisfaction, not of victory in the world's eyes, but of a love that had endured, unwavering, unbroken, and true. His hand instinctively touched the pocket where Elizabeth's letter lay, fingers brushing the soft folds of paper, and he murmured softly, almost to himself, "Tell Her Majesty I die her faithful servant." The words were not for any living soul but for the silent witness of the room, for the echo of a devotion that had defined him. And as the fire flickered, as the shadows lengthened, he closed his eyes, allowing the warmth of her affection, so carefully given, to cradle him in his final moments. Robert Dudley passed quietly, his body succumbing to the inexorable pull of age and fatigue, yet his spirit carrying the quiet triumph of a heart steadfast to the very end. He had waited, served, and loved with a constancy that few could comprehend. And though the world would remember him in titles, in campaigns, and in courtly favor, his heart had belonged entirely to one woman, a queen who had understood, in her own silent way, the depth of what had passed between them. The autumn sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the manor grounds, as if honoring the passage of a man whose life had been defined not by conquest or power, but by devotion, patience, and the quiet endurance of a love that time, distance, and circumstance could never diminish. When the news of Robert's death reached Elizabeth, the world outside her chambers seemed to vanish. Courtiers whispered in hushed tones, advisers fretted, and the machinery of the realm continued its relentless rhythm, but inside the Queen's private rooms, time came to a slow, suffocating halt. She closed the doors behind her, turned the key, and withdrew into silence. For 3 days the palace seemed emptied of her presence, her voice unheard, her steps hidden from all. In the dim light of her chambers she sat alone, the weight of grief pressing upon her like the heaviest of crowns. The walls that had contained her authority now contained her sorrow, echoing with the memory of decades spent beside the man she had loved in secret, the man who had waited patiently, steadfastly, through every trial, every whisper, every danger that had shadowed their lives. She thought of his letters, his unwavering devotion, the countless ways he had been near without ever overstepping the delicate boundaries of duty. She remembered the softness of his gaze, the quiet humor, the courage he had shown not only on distant battlefields, but in every moment he had spent at her side. And in the depth of her solitude she allowed herself to feel fully, without restraint, without calculation, without the constant vigilance demanded by crown and court. After 3 days, the world pressed upon her once more. Advisers knocked, courtiers waited, and the responsibilities of the realm could no longer be paused. She rose, composed herself, and returned to the corridors of power, carrying her grief silently, as she had carried so much else throughout her reign. And yet, when she withdrew each night to her chambers, she would reach for the small, delicate letter he had pressed into her hands all those years ago, the letter that had traveled across miles, across campaigns, across the decades of their shared lives. She kept it in a tiny, carefully hidden box by her bedside, a private testament to a love that the world could never touch, a love that had endured through secrecy, restraint, scandal, and silence. And when she gazed upon it, she remembered him, the boy who had shared her childhood, the man who had waited, the friend who had been her constant, her confidant, and her heart's companion through every trial. And so the story of Robert Dudley and Elizabeth I remained, not in the proclamations of the court, not in the pages of history written by others, but in the quiet, intimate spaces where love endured beyond the reach of time, politics, or circumstance. She was Queen of England, the Virgin Queen, a symbol of authority and unreachability. Yet in the small box by her bed lay a single letter, the proof that she had known love, that she had loved fully, and that all those years, all those trials, had been shared with the one man who had held her heart above all else. His name was Robert, but to her, in the private, sacred language of decades, he would always be her Robin,